Okay, so tonight we have 4 really good questions. The first is just a small question. Why did God create us? Does he need us? Yes. Yes. And the second question is a more familiar one. Why did God create evil? And our third question is, can we question God? Is that permitted to question God? Or does it indicate some kind of lack of faith? And the fourth question is an interesting one, because why is God described as wrathful and jealous? So that's our program for tonight.
What page is it?
Well, no page just yet. I'll call out a page number when we're ready to look at the texts. So let's start with the first question as to why did God create us, or does he need us? And it's a catch-22 problem, you see. There is a real problem over here, because on the one hand, we would like to think that God does in some way or another need us, because otherwise, why are we here?
Yeah.
What purpose could we possibly have? Just to create human beings to go through all this business of life and all of its difficulties and its ups and downs seems all a bit meaningless unless there's something that he needs. But on the other hand, how can you ever speak about God needing? To need something means that there's something which you don't have. There's something which is still to be fulfilled. And you can't say about the Almighty that he is unfulfilled. You have to say that he has everything that he needs. Okay? So we have a real catch-22 when we try to articulate this problem. And there is a kind of a solution to this problem, but it doesn't work. If you turn it the other way around and say, well, it's not that God needs us, but we need him. But that still doesn't quite do it, does it? Because it doesn't know why we are here in the first place. So just for those of you who are just joining us from abroad, I see my sister calling is with us from Portland, Oregon, all the way. That's why it's good to have this on. She would have come, but she has to start a little bit earlier in the week to get here. We're looking at 4 questions tonight. And the first one is, why did God create us? Does he need us? And the second is, why did God create evil? And the third is, can we question God? And the fourth is, why is God described as wrathful and jealous? Good to have you with us. Come and join us. That's okay. We just started. And we are beginning to ask the question about, does God need us? And the problem with that question, that if he, just to say it again, if he does need us, then it shows something imperfect about him. And if he doesn't need us, why are we here? Okay, everybody understand the nature of the catch-22? Okay. So how are we going to approach this problem? How are we going to begin to get around it? Where's the starting point how do you ask what God needs, what God doesn't need? Fortunately, we have a verse in the book of Job in which he says, "Mibasari echze elaka," from my flesh I can understand God. And what he means by that is that if we are created in the image of God, then let us presume that something in our own structure, in terms of the way in which we're built, our own psychological framework, etc., will reflect something about God. Because if I'm created in his image, there has to be a parallel. Obviously, it's very different levels. I'm human and God is infinite. But there must be some kind of correlation between the way in which we're made and God. So if we can look at something about our needs and why we need, we might be able to get closer to understanding whether God needs. Okay. And one of the places to start looking about our needs is the way in which we need to connect with another human being. We call this an institution marriage. I mean, it was the case that and probably still the case, that the majority of people get married at some point in their lives. In past generations, there were lots of very good, solid reasons for getting married. And as you know, in today's day and age, most, if not all of these reasons, hi Deborah, are gone. But strangely enough, marriage hasn't gone. So you'll find young people who might be living together for many, many years, and then they decide to get married. And I always ask them, if it's worked so well for you up until now, why are you getting married? And there's all kinds of answers about, well, you know, it's commitment, it changes us psychologically, etc. But if you look at this thing called marriage, there was a woman, an Australian-born journalist called Belinda Luscombe, and she wrote about this topic, and we're going to see what she says on page 77 now. This is the first text we're going to look at. Deborah, you're going to have to come and share with some of you, but I'm going to read out all the texts in any event, so even if you don't have it, it doesn't matter. And she said the following. This is an article which was called "Who Needs Marriage? A Changing Institution?" And it was in Time in November 2010. And what she says is, what we have found is that marriage, whatever its social, spiritual, or symbolic appeal, is in purely practical terms just not as necessary as it used to be. Neither men nor women need to be married to have sex, or companionship, or professional success, or respect, or even children. And yet marriage remains revered and desired. But if marriage is no longer obligatory, or even in certain cases helpful, then what is it for? And that is the question that she asks. Well, you know, Groucho Marx once declared, marriage is a wonderful institution, but who wants to live in an institution? Because as we all know, those of us who, I think all around the table over here, everybody has been married or is married, and the reality is not all that easy. And it's filled with lots of challenges. So why do people seek marriage? Or even if not marriage, why do they seek a long-term, intimate relationship with another human being? And the answer is because people need to love and to be loved. Okay? And we're hardwired in this regard. From the very beginning of creation, this was one of the key characteristics of humankind. You don't have to look at it because it's a very short text, but it would be on text 3a on page 78. God said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make for him a helpmate alongside him." So now just imagine this. This is a little thought experiment, okay? Imagine that you could create a robot, which, by the way, is not so far-fetched because we're reading about these things right now. Supposing you could create a robot that is imbued with intelligence and consciousness, and you could program it to give you everything you're looking for from a spouse or a partner. So this robot would provide you with love, with companionship, with sensitivity, with commitment, wouldn't argue back, which would be a great pleasure, wouldn't aggravate you. You could even have sex, because robots today are providing that for people who are lonely. And the question is this: would you be satisfied? And if not, why not? Doesn't have a soul. What does a soul give you? Feedback. Well, actually, it's something a little bit deeper than that. It's not just that it doesn't have a soul, because it's doing all the things that you need from a relationship. But the answer is, you want to be chosen to be loved. If a robot loves me because I programmed it to love me, it's not it loving me, it's me loving me.
Yeah.
All you've done is you've created a mirror to reflect back to yourself your needs. So we don't get married because we want to amplify self-love. We marry another person to love them and for them to love us in return. So maybe we could now suggest, if that's the way it works in human beings, is there some kind of parallel in the level of the divine? Could we possibly suggest that the reason that we were created to need someone to choose to love us, and the reason why we're not content to be alone, because in some sense that reflects God as well? Let's get into that a little bit more deeply. There's a very daring reinterpretation of the verse which I just quoted you about man and women. God said, it's not good for man to be alone. I will make for him a helpmate alongside him. And in this verse over here, it is not good for man to be alone. We're presuming that man means human beings. But Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi applies this word man, not to man, but to God, because there are places in which God is referred to as a man. So when we're saying it is not good for man to be alone, and this is really radical, you're saying it's not good for God to be alone either. In the same way, it's not good for man to be alone. So now, let's take a look at text 3b on page 79, in which he articulates this idea. A little bit complex wording over here, but we get to it towards the end. When man manifests himself by the name of the Tetragrammaton, the Havaya, he is described as a man, as it is written in the book of Ezekiel, upon the heavenly throne there was the image in the likeness of a man. God is alone, therefore it is not good for man to be alone, can also refer to it as not good for God to be alone. God is alone when he is revealed without any garment or concealment. And this state is described in the verse, you, God, are completely alone in Nehemiah. For when he is fully revealed, it is impossible for anything else to exist other than the man who is alone. There's nothing outside of God alone. And this was not God's intention, he continues to say. For he created the universe, he created the world, because he desires to have a home for himself in the lowest realm, and therefore he said, it is not good for man, i.e. God, to be alone. Instead, I will make him a helpmate opposite him. So there's something over here about God saying, I want to create a world, and in that world, I want to have a reciprocal. I want, in the same way that a man and a woman need each other, God is saying, I want a world in which I can have an other with whom I can relate. That's what I want. So the purpose of that other, in other words, mankind, is in order that there should be a connection or a bond between finite human being and infinite God. But there's a difference between us and God in this respect. We need to love and to be loved. It's a deep, profound instinct in every one of us. In the same way that we need to eat, or we need to procreate. God doesn't need to have a world, mankind, with which he relates. He chose to have it. And therein is a big difference. So God doesn't need it, but he chooses it. And needing and choosing are two very different things. God chooses to be embraced by us. And that is why our sages, when they discuss this, use the expression, God desired. Because a desire is not logical. You can't explain why you want something. Why do you want it? Because I want it. How are you going to explain the logic behind that? There's two apples in front of you. One is red and one is green. Why do you want the red apple? I like red. Okay. Why do you like red? I just like red. There's no logic. I like it. I desire it. And therefore, when you speak about why did God create the world, and you say he desired to have a world, you're saying, I can't go any further than that. This is a text over here, page 130. Sorry, page 81, 130 in my book, text number 4. I heard, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that in his early discourses in Lyozna, the first Chabad Rebbe said, God desired to have a home for himself in the lowest realm. It is something he simply desired. And on a desire, you don't ask questions. In other words, a desire transcends logic. So let's now come back to our question over here, the question with which we started this particular piece over here. Why did God create a world? Does he need us? And the answer is, he created a world because he wanted, desired, beyond logic, he desired to create an entity with whom he could have a relationship. Does he need us? And the answer is, no, he doesn't need us. But he chose to have this relationship. And that therefore reframes this question and puts it into a different perspective. So ultimately, we can't say, I know why God created the world. I know what was in his mind. I know what was in his logic, because there wasn't a logic per se. You can't ask a question on, I wanted to do it. Okay. Does he need us? Well, he wanted us. He doesn't need us because we've already said you can't say God needs because it implies that he's not perfect. But you can say that God chose. So here we are locked into a relationship with him in which he wants to reach down to us and he wants to encourage us to reach up to him. And it's a fact. Can't argue with it, you can't fight with it. We're here. Okay. That's the answer to our first question. Okay, anybody want to comment? Anybody want to argue? Anybody want to question? Yeah, Deborah.
Okay, so that would make sense that God would want us to have a relationship with us. But if you look past the Naveen, he hasn't really been talking that much with us or interacting on a direct level. I mean, sure, on an indirect level, but you know what I'm saying?
Okay, so the question over here for those of you onliners from Deborah over here is, can understand, you know, that God wants to have a relationship with us, but actually when you look at the relationship, in fact, he doesn't interact with us that much, at least not on a perceivable level. We did talk about this a bit last week in the session last week, in which we asked about how God communicates with us. And we said, yes, okay, there was a big communication once called Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. And then there was another set of communications which came through the prophets. But after that stopped, hey, where does he talk to us? And we wanted to suggest that actually, in a much more subtle way, there is messaging coming to us all the time, either directly through our souls, which lead us in certain directions, or in the more subtle messages that he sends us in terms of the places that he leads us to and the things that we see and experience, which are all messages from God to this particular individual who saw this thing, as opposed to another person who saw that thing, in order to guide us in our lives. So it's a much more subtle process. It's a much deeper process, and it's one you have to be tuned into. Otherwise, you miss it completely. Okay. Our second question tonight: why did God create evil? Anybody like to suggest why God created evil?
Maybe it was us that created it.
Pardon?
Maybe it was us that created it.
Maybe it was us who created evil. Excellent, Catherine. Maybe we created evil. Any other suggestions?
Fight against it,
Pardon?
so we could recognize it as.
So we could recognize it and fight against it. Another great suggestion. Any others?
So that we understand what's good.
We understand what's good on a similar theme.
Yeah.
Robin, Lyd? Nothing? All right.
Because we have free will, and
We have free will. Okay, another great suggestion. So in the last days of Moses' life, he tells the Jews about the great rewards which are going to accrue to them if they observe God's law. Text number 5a on page 82. If you observe God's commandments and you walk in his ways, taken from the book of Deuteronomy, God will establish you as his holy people, as he swore to you. Now, this phrase in the Chumash, in the Bible, says, if you walk in his ways. And the sages are very interested to know, how do you walk in God's ways? What kind of walk is it? Is it a fast walk? Is it a slow walk? Pardon?
It's not literally.
It's not a literal walk. How do you walk? So anyway, Maimonides says, I'm going to explain to you how you walk in God's ways. And that's in text 5b on page 83. This is Maimonides. We are commanded to emulate God to the best of our ability. And we derive this from the verse, you shall walk in his ways. In other words, to walk in his ways means to emulate him. This commandment is reiterated in the verse, observe all these commandments that I command you, to love your God and to walk in all of his ways. And the Sifri, the Medrash, explains this verse to mean as follows. What does it mean to emulate God? Just as God is gracious, so you be gracious. Just as God is called compassionate, you be compassionate. Just as God is called kind, you be kind. That's what it means to walk in his ways. So, simply put, the way it's put over here, God is benevolent and compassionate, and therefore to act godly, to walk in his ways, we should also be good and benevolent and compassionate, okay? All very well. But this leads us to the question that if God is the ultimate of goodness and kindness, why did he create a world that is rife with evil? A world in which there's thievery, abuse, murder. Heck, it's a world in which you have to say to your small children, you be careful about the bad people around when you're walking in the street. Why? If he is a good, a kind, and a compassionate God. Well, first of all, we need to define the word evil here, because the Webster Dictionary defines evil as an individual or an act that is, quote, morally reprehensible, close quote. And Maimonides explains, not in this text over here for the moment, that there is only one species in all of creation that is capable of doing something that is morally reprehensible. It's in text number 6 on page 84. Freedom of choice. Who said freedom of choice a while back? Well done. Freedom of choice is granted to all human beings. If one desires to turn toward the path of good and be righteous, they are free to do so. Should one desire to turn to the path of evil and be wicked, they are free to do so. And this is the significance of the Torah's statement, behold, the human being has become like one of us with the ability to know good and evil. That was, of course, after the eating from the fruit of the tree of good and evil. Meaning that the human species became unique in the world, with no other species in it, no other species like it, in that they are aware of good and evil and can do whatever they desire. And no one can prevent the human being from doing good or evil. So in this piece, Maimonides correlates good and evil with free will. Okay. Without free will, the human ability to choose, there is no good and evil. And in his view, this belongs only to a human being. You see, imagine the following. If a healthy adult chooses to sleep 20 hours a day and to move less than 50 yards throughout the day, you would call them what? Lazy, slothful and lazy. Ironically, a sloth, i.e. the animal, can't be defined as lazy, although it keeps exactly the same schedule. Okay. And this is because the term lazy carries with it a certain weight of moral judgment. Humans have a responsibility, we believe, to be active, to be productive. And you can choose whether to embrace that or whether to ignore it. And if you ignore it, then you're called lazy and it's seen as a failing. But for the animal, it's not a failing. It's just the way it is. Sloths are not doing anything wrong. They're just acting the way sloths have to act, okay? And what about the greedy hog, the greedy pig? And what about the vicious crocodile? And what about the rampaging bull? And all these terms that we put to these animals. You can't make a moral judgment about it, about them. You can't say that that shark that attacks you in the water is doing something evil. It's doing what it was made to do. It has no choice in the matter. There is no free choice for that animal. And therefore, they don't have any moral culpability. You can't attach the label moral to their actions. Only human beings have the ability to choose their actions, and therefore only human beings can be called moral or immoral. Okay? And the flip side of this distinction is that we are also the only creatures, the only species in the world who are capable of goodness. What about the wise owl? What about the helpful dolphin? Like it needs a big yesher koach for having help, for help. The dog that comes to rescue. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. But are they making a moral choice?
I think some animals do. Elephants are a bit more.
Some elephants, the way they care for them, but it's instinctive. It's not choosing. It's something which they have to do. You can't say you're a good elephant. You're a good mummy elephant because you looked after your young one, and you're a bad mummy elephant because you didn't look after your young one. The mummy elephant is programmed to look after and protect the young one. The herd is programmed to protect the young and to travel with them. So let's come back to the question of why God allows evil. So at the most basic level, we could say that it's an order that we should choose goodness. If there was no choice between good or bad in this world, could you ever use the term good? No.
In actual fact, if you only had goodness, you can't only be good, because there are times you have to make choices which are not good for some people and are bad, but they have to be made because of the majority will benefit. So you can't, good is really a classification that can't be generalized and total. It is something relative, I guess.
And more than that, goodness can only exist because its opposite exists as well. That's how you can define something as good. It's good because it's not bad. So evil is there really as the option for us to choose good. And we'll come back to this a little bit later in one of the other questions. Simon.
Are we saying that God doesn't have good and evil? And only humans have this choice?
At this point, yes, that is what we're saying. We're going to ask this question a little bit later about God's anger and his wrathfulness, etc., where we will touch on what belongs to God. But at this point in time, what we're saying is that he created evil in the sense that it's as a human condition for us to be able to make the choices. Not that he is evil, but that he has allowed things evil to happen in the world.
But he doesn't, or he or she doesn't make that choice.
Who? God.
God.
No, God doesn't make that choice.
God is goodly the whole time.
Yes. Deborah?
It's kind of a passive view of God.
Pardon?
It sounds like a bit of a passive.
It sounds a bit.
God, that God lets evil happen.
Well, just hold that until we've finished our discussions tonight, because some of that will come into perspective a little bit later, okay?
So I have a question.
Yes.
So, and he might have answered it, I couldn't quite hear that. But if we are walking with God, we're talking about all the good, but we know that God is angry, he can be vindictive, he can have all those other characteristics. So can we presume that that is why we have all these characters in ourselves? Because if we are walking with God, we have those characters from the full spectrum of characters from God.
That's a very good question, Lyd. And just wait for our next text, which is coming up in just a moment, in which we'll get to the core of that. But I just want to finish what we're saying over here is just to make this very clear. If God were to hit the smite button every time a person made the wrong choice, then it would completely take away the notion of being able to choose good. Nobody would ever do anything else. There would be no free choice. Free choice can only exist if there is the possibility of doing one or the other. And the reality is that, just to come to Simon's point over here, or to Deborah's, that when people choose to pursue evil, by and large, God generally does not intervene. He's created this moral system. He's put human beings in it. And this is a great experiment to see how it's going to pan out. What will these people do with these choices that I've given them? But to come back to this point that Lydia has mentioned over here, please take a look at text number 7 on page 85. Because in a deeper sense, our ability to choose is because we were created in God's image. Because the ability to choose is a quality that we share with none other than with the Creator. And that's what text number 7 says. Now we understand the idea of let us make man. God created man in his image, because human beings are created in God's image, and they too have free choice. And as explained elsewhere, the human being's freedom to choose derives from a very exalted place, from the quality of sovereignty. This quality derives directly from God. For kingship and sovereignty belong to he who lives forever. God is sovereign, and no one can prevent him from doing as he wishes. And similarly, because we are created in God's image, he instills in us that very same characteristic. Similarly, free choice is granted to humans to the extent that no one can prevent them from doing what they choose. And that is why God doesn't intervene, because he's invested in us as human beings the quality of absolute free choice. And just as he can do whatever he wants and no one can intervene, he gave us that same quality. Actually, this is awesome. The only question is, what do we do with it? That's the great test and experiment. So God has infinite options. He chose to create the world in kindness. He creates humanity, created in his image, and he gives us this ability to choose. So when we see or we read about horrific acts of evil, the purpose of it is in order to remind us of our humanity, of our sacred role, of the world in which he wanted us to live in. Yes, the perpetrator might have chosen to abuse the greatest gift that is given to mankind, the gift of free choice. And the very sense, the unsettled sense, the chill, the disturbed emotions that we have when we see evil being perpetrated is because we know that it's the wrong thing, because we have a moral sense, because as a result of seeing that, we resolve, and I am not going to do that, I'm going to do the right thing, I'm going to be good. And in a sense, we bounce off those negatives to choose the opposite. And we remain, and we'll come back to this in a beautiful piece from Jonathan Sachs a little bit later this evening. But when we see people doing the wrong thing, the reason why we're disturbed, the reason why it upsets us, is because we have a moral sense. And we say, that's wrong. That shouldn't happen. That's evil. I'm outraged by that behavior.
Not everybody feels that way.
Decent human beings do.
But not everybody's a decent human being.
That is true.
What about the people who are doing the wrong thing? Are they doing it just for our benefit?
No, no, they've made the wrong choice in their lives. They too had free choice and they abused it.
But we need them to do it.
We'd prefer them not to do it. We'd prefer it if we could always see this way and that way and make the right choice. We'd prefer not to have real life examples of evil. It'd be a much better world if we didn't have to see that. But having seen that, it should spur us to make a greater effort to create a better world. So the answer to our second question tonight, why did God create evil, is that he simply allows evil in order to enable true goodness. So there should be the free choice to choose good and to allow us to emulate him. And you know, I once asked Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory. He was one of the wisest men that I'd ever had the privilege of knowing well and being able to talk to. One of the deepest thinkers. He passed away just a few years ago and wrote many, many books and very famous. And he was an original thinker. And I said to him, Rabbi Adin, I understand that God, puts evil in the world and we may have to make a choice, but why does it have to be so much evil? Why does it have to be so much pain? It just seems that it could have done it with a slightly lighter touch. Yeah. And he said to me, Shlomo, when a scientist in his lab creates an experiment, the only way in which he's going to test the validity of his experiment is if he takes it to breaking point. Up until the nth degree, you don't actually know whether it is robust or not. And the Almighty created a world, this great experiment of his, put human beings in it, gave us some of his essence, free choice, showed us how to emulate him, and then left it to us. And we screw up big time.
So therefore, even though he created, it came as a byproduct.
He allowed evil to be. You see, let me tell you, this problem of evil is a huge thing for Christians in particular. It's a very big issue over here, because some of the theologians have said, well, there's two forces. How could a good God create evil? That's, of course, always your problem. And that's what we start with over here. And some people posit, therefore, that there are two forces. There's a force called good and there's another force called evil. Judaism never bought into that. There's only one God. That's where we start. Whatever comes out of that God must be from him and from nowhere else. If there is evil in the world, it must be because he allowed it to be here. He created it in some form. Not that he is evil, not that it's part of him, but it was part of the necessity of this test, of this experiment of humanness, of human choice, for us to be able to choose which way we want this world to be.
He didn't give us evil per se, it really came as a byproduct.
Yes, yes,
Of the choice. of
yes,
free will.
yes, yeah.
And we.
Deborah,
Two questions.
two questions coming up.
One is, if it's an experiment, you would think like there's been enough genocides for the experiment to have massively failed.
So if it's an experiment, you would have been, what, enough time for the,
Genocides.
enough genocides, there've been enough genocides for the experiment to have changed, to have failed.
Then
Yeah.
said, okay,
Yeah.
experiments off, like,
Yeah.
is there like some boiling point?
Yeah. Well, clearly the experiment hasn't failed yet, because there's still an incredible amount of good in this world. And if you have any doubts about ever having seen that, just take yourself back to COVID. And look what happened when we faced that crisis. Look at what it brought out in human beings in terms of goodness. Look what people did for each other. Look at the way they cared for each other. It was incredible. Well, there must have been.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there is one in the world, but the experiment I did. What is the experiment called?
Does somebody have there's some feedback coming through here, pardon?
Someone needs to mute.
Yeah, somebody that just needs to mute for the moment, please. Okay,
That was one.
okay. That was God speaking.
The experiment I did is very interesting, but I was just asking, what's the real question about? Okay, so I'm going to create man and see if there's goodness. Okay, there's clearly wonderful goodness. There's clearly one extraordinary evil.
So Deborah's saying, okay, there's goodness and there's evil. So now what? The answer is that we take a Jewish view that the world is purposeful and it is leading to an ultimate purpose. And we have not yet fulfilled that ultimate purpose. The purpose of creation is that we create human beings, we create a finite world, and its ultimate purpose is, as we say in our Lein l'Shabeach, the whole world comes to recognize that there is a God, and he puts the Jewish nation in pole position to spread this message, to teach it, to act it, and we have not yet fulfilled our destiny, and we're still on the road, but we haven't arrived yet.
Do we know what that destiny is?
Yes, a world which recognizes the existence of God, a world in which human beings ultimately begin to recognize that wars are not going to work. It's much better if we help each other, work together with each other, a messianic concept. Okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry, can we go back to the Garden of Eden then?
The Garden of Eden, all the way back. Pardon?
It didn't start with this. This arose.
Yes, but
because of creation.
Simon, that's one of our earlier courses about whether God actually wanted or desired or wished Adam and Eve to eat from the tree and to create the good and evil and the confusion between it. Just let's leave it where otherwise we're into a whole different kind of ball game over here. Okay, so just We'll come, private conversation, we'll come back to that. Yes, Deborah.
God lets it.
God lets it happen. Question about evil.
And all these prayers and all these psalms like from David, my Savior, I prayed to you and you made everything better and got my enemies.
Yes.
Why are we praying to God, and why did David pray to God?
Why did David pray to God, to help him with his enemies? Because sometimes when you're surrounded by negativity in your life, you need a little bit of help from upstairs. You need the courage and the strength and the ability to carry on. And prayer is one of the ways in which we draw that strength down into ourselves and face the challenges of our lives. God might not have changed anything, but what did change was something within King David himself as a result of his prayers. Can we question God? Is it permitted? Well, we do question God, but is it permitted? Are you doing a big no-no if you find yourself questioning God? So, of course, we'll have a huge amount to be thankful for. But on the other hand, as we all know, life often features some unfathomable hardships. On a personal level, people might suffer from illness or from poverty or from emotional pain. On a collective level, there are huge global issues such as epidemics and natural disasters. Are we permitted as Jews to question God or to ask why God allows or possibly even causes so much suffering in this world? And if does asking these questions imply a smallness or a lack of faith? Well, this issue that we are going to explore here has a big name. It's called theodicy, but it's got a much simpler name as well. It's called, why do bad things happen to good people? So I suppose foundational in this is a principle of Jewish faith that God is beyond and infinitely beyond us, and we don't always understand what God does. But nevertheless, when you look at some of our great prophets, even starting with Moses, so after the incident of the golden calf, Moses says to God, Hareini na et, show me your ways. I want to know your ways. And the Talmud interprets this question of Moses's as seeking to understand why it is that the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. That's Moses's question. And God accedes to his request. He says, yes, I'll show you my ways. I'll answer your question, but there's a caveat. You will see my back, but my face shall not be seen. That's what God answers to Moses. Well, one of the leading rabbis of European Jewry in the 19th century was called the Khatam Sofer. And he takes this imagery of you shall see my back, and he explains it in text number 88 on page 87. We often see events, I'm fine, thank you. We often see events that make us wonder, why did God do this? But when we look back after enough time, we can discern the purpose God set in motion by these seemingly adverse events and see how they paved the way for a wonderful result. For example, the miracle of Purim, the killing of Vashti, the abduction of Esther, and all the surrounding events prepared the way for the Jewish people's salvation. And yet, until Achashverosh issued his final decree, we had no way of knowing this. We could only believe without a doubt that nothing that God does is senseless. It is only from our perspective that the reason is unknown and mysterious. And this faith is beneficial because God rewards our belief. And this is why God told Moses, you will see my back. After an event leads to its purpose, you can look back and you'll be able to see and understand what I did and why. However, my face shall not be seen. You'll be unable to discern my purpose before it is complete. Well, what he's saying over here is that when we experience hardship and pain, we simply can't understand the purpose. But we don't assume that there's no purpose. Sometimes in our lives, we get 20/20 hindsight. You never get 20/20 foresight, I'm afraid. And it'd be very nice if we could. But you look back at certain things which happened, which at the time seemed completely incomprehensible. And years later, you look back at those events and you say, oh, that led to that, which then led to that, which then led to that, and then led to the good space that I'm in here in today. And you couldn't see it at the time. Now, let me be very clear. You don't always get 20/20 hindsight. Sometimes in life, you're just left with the puzzle and the why. And sometimes in life, it's like the veil is lifted and you see things with absolute pristine clarity, and then the veil closes again. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean to say that we can never question God and ask why. Some of our greatest Jewish leaders questioned God and asked why. So once again, Moses goes to Pharaoh. He's following God's instructions. And he says, let my people go, etc. And the result of all of that is Pharaoh says, you guys, you're only asking these questions because you've got too much time in your hands. I'm going to make things a lot worse for you. Takes away all the straw and the straw, and it says, go and build the same quantity of bricks, but without straw. Go and find the straw. And things are terrible. And the people are crying out to Moses, you came over here, you made things worse. You know, get out of our lives. Who needs you? It's bad enough already. We need you to come and make things a lot worse. And God turns around. Moses turns around to God. Extraordinary. Take a look at text 9a on page 88. Moses returned to God and said, my Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why have you sent me? Is that not questioning God? And Moses was a man of faith. But he looks almost as if he's lost it here. So does this simply imply a weakness in Moses' faith in God, or faith in God's justice and goodness? But take a look at text 9b on page 89 from the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. Obviously, when Moses gathered the courage to ask the question, why have you done evil to these people? He did not say these words coolly and apathetically. The question was certainly voiced with much passion and agitation, because Moses embodied divine wisdom, and wisdom demands that there should be an objection. Why have you done evil to this people? And the Torah records this as a lesson, teaching us. This is the Lubavitcher Rebbe speaking. The Torah is teaching us a lesson here, that we ought to cry out and to ask, why have you done this? God wants our minds to seek understanding. And when done correctly, this in no way contradicts, God forbid, our perfect faith in God's goodness. Because if God didn't want us to use our brain, he wouldn't have given us one. But he granted us the capacity for curiosity and intelligence. And therefore, when we see suffering and tragedy, It's entirely appropriate to be bothered and to be pained. Our sense of justice, our sense of right is offended. And to ask and demand, God, why have you done this? We may be the only religion in the world that permits this kind of questioning. I'm not an expert in all religions, but it is a feature of Judaism that we can have these arguments with the divine and we can ask these questions and nevertheless remain faithful to him. And you see, there are two ways in which you can ask this question. It sounds different when it's asked by a non-believer or asked by a believer. When a non-believer asks the question, why have you done this? What he's asking is, why should I believe in a benevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent God if I have witnessed such tragedies? And when a believer asks the same question, he says, God, I know that you're benevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Why then did you allow this to happen? And it's one question, but asked in very different ways. And the prophet Jeremiah put it very succinctly. It's a beautiful quotation. It's text number 10 on page 91. God, when I argue with you, you are always right. Yet, I will still complain to you. Why does the way of the wicked prosper, and all who deal with treachery enjoy tranquility? I know you're right. It doesn't stop me from asking. See, Jeremiah was very well aware that he's just a small human being. He's in the shadow of God. But after a stormy tussle with the God, the inevitable conclusion must be that although we don't and can't understand, God has perfect reasons that lie beyond us. I tell the story again, which I think I might have mentioned before, about Elie Wiesel, the survivor of the camps, and how he describes it. Immediately they were saved from the camps. They held a trial, the survivors held a trial in which they put God on trial. And they had prosecution and defense and a judge, and they ran a proper trial. And at the end, the judge ruled that God was to blame. He was in the wrong. And with that, he banged with his gavel on the thing, said, God is to blame. Now let's go and daven mincha. And they got up to daven mincha. And that's really powerful. Jonathan Sacks, as always, puts this really beautifully. It's text number 11 on page 91. It's from his book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? And he says the following: there are some questions to which the very greatest of the great don't wish to know the answer. Don't wish to know the answer. Isn't that strange? We all thought we wanted to know the answer. And he says, no, we don't want to know the answer. If we found an argument that satisfied us as to why bad things happen to good people, we would be reconciled with bad things happening to good people. But because we have the question and we don't yet have the answer, we are not reconciled. And therefore, we fight so that bad things do not continue to happen to good people. And that is why you will find Jews disproportionately represented among doctors fighting disease, economists fighting poverty, teachers fighting ignorance, and lawyers fighting injustice. Why? because we refuse to answer the question of why bad things happen to good people. We try to create a world in which fewer and fewer bad things happen. And that, I think, is the Jewish way. Sometimes faith lies in the question, not in the answer. You see, if we knew the answer, we would no longer feel any empathy or be moved by the plight of the person who's suffering. You wouldn't be able to offer a listening ear or a comforting touch or an empathetic heart. You turn to the person and says, oh no, I know why you're suffering. Actually, I've seen it all. You really deserve it. So why do you require my sympathy? Human sympathy and caring. Look, I was at a funeral today. There were a huge crowd. I joked that there were so many people it made the Hajj look like a picnic. I've never seen so many people because of a lovely, ordinary human being who, with his wife and his sister-in-law and his brother-in-law, were in a terrible car crash in Spain, and he lost his life. And just a short while ago, 2-3 years ago, he lost his son to COVID. This family is grieving a second time. Imagine if you had the answer to why. There was such an outpouring of love and care and compassion, such an embrace for this family. And the reason is because we don't know the reason why. And Jonathan Sacks was incredibly perceptive in saying that sometimes there's a question to which we do not want the answer. Because without the answer, we care and we feel. Nevertheless, we have to persist in asking the unanswerable why. And we're driven to answer, but because we persist in asking the unanswerable why, we are then driven to ask the answerable question of what. If you can't answer why, you ask what. What can I do to alleviate the suffering? And that puts us into a different category altogether. So the answer to our third question tonight, can we question God, is, although we believe that God is just and good, at the same time, we must protest and question when we perceive injustice and suffering in this world. And our last question tonight, why is God described as wrathful and jealous? Does he really have these terrible traits? You see, it's frequently quoted that the Jewish God, you know who the Jewish God is? He is the God of the Old Testament, okay? The Jewish God is an angry and a jealous God. We've all heard this hundreds of times, right? Everybody knows. The God of the Old Testament, in contrast to the compassionate, caring, loving God of the New Testament, is a wrathful and a jealous God. And the problem is that the Torah seems to lend support to this, because there are lots of verses that depict God's anger and his jealousy and his vengeance. So how can you accept a God who acts out of jealousy and anger? You want to serve God out of fear? That's not a good scene. And to make matters worse, God expects us to not get angry and jealous. He's allowed to, but we're not allowed to. And even more difficult is, as we've been saying earlier this evening, we have to walk in his ways. We're supposed to emulate him. So what we should emulate is jealousy and his anger. So before we respond to this, there's a really interesting exercise. It's exercise 3.2 on page 93. The number of questions. It's called Name the Author. Try to guess the authors of the following two quotes. The first quote is, where there's only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. Who said this? Yasser Arafat, Winston Churchill, Mahatma Gandhi, Franklin D. Roosevelt, or Joseph Stalin?
Joseph Stalin
Joseph Stalin, okay.
or Yasser Arafat.
Or Yasser Arafat, or Mahatma Gandhi.
No, not Mahatma.
Second question. We must finally understand that of all the precious capital in the world, the most precious capital, the most decisive capital is human beings. Who said this? Yasser Arafat, Winston Churchill, Mahatma Gandhi, Franklin D. Roosevelt, or Joseph Stalin? Okay, so well done, everyone. The first quote, where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence, was written by the peace-loving, non-violent resistance advocating Gandhi. And the second quote, well done, Catherine. The second quote, that we must fully understand that of all the precious capital in the world, the most precious capital, the most decisive capital is human beings, was declared by Stalin, the most ruthless murderer of millions. 20 million.
Amazing.
Pardon? Yeah,
Amazing.
incredible. Yeah. You see, when you hear a quote that has been cherry-picked from a large body of work, it's really important to know the full context before you jump to conclusions. There is a saying that if you separate a text from its context, all you're left with is the con. Now, it's true that you can cherry pick quotes from the Torah, and you can describe God's anger or characterize him as jealous and vengeful. But the same Torah, in countless instances, refers to his kindness and his compassion. And throughout the Torah, you'll find that there is, on the one hand, justice and mercy, and on the other hand, anger and jealousy. And we'll soon learn why that's important. But before we go there, we need to set the record straight. Because taken as a whole, the overwhelming voice of God in the Torah is one of love and kindness and compassion and mercy and patience. Overwhelmingly so. Let's just take one of the most quoted verses of the Ten Commandments that implies God's wrathfulness and jealousy. Text 12a on page 94. From the Ten Commandments, okay? Book of Exodus. You shall not bow down nor worship any other God, for I, your God, am a jealous God, who visits the iniquity of the parents upon the children, upon the third and fourth generations for those who hate me. That sounds pretty rough. But what is conveniently left out from this quote when people want to use this as evidence of a jealous and a wrathful God is that they forgot to quote the rest of the sentence, which reads as follows in text 12b on page 95. And I perform kindness to thousands of generations for those who love me and for those who observe my commandments. So in the very same breath that God is described as being a jealous God who exacts punishment for generations, which, by the way, just to understand what this means, it only refers to a situation in which subsequent generations continue in the idolatrous footsteps of their ancestors. That's the only context in which this actually is applied. But in that same breath, God is described as a kind God who promises love and care. And as the Talmudic sages note, in far greater measure, just take a look at text 12c now on page 95 still. God's trait of benevolence is greater than his attribute of punishment by a ratio of 1 to 500. How do we can't get to that? Because concerning punishment, it is written, he visits the iniquity of parents upon the children's children to the third and fourth generations. Concerning his kindness, in the same verse, it says, I perform kindness to thousands of generations. He repays kindness 500 times more than he exacts retribution. It's just the maths between the third and fourth and 1,000. Okay. So if we were to characterize the Jewish God, the God that who we know through the Torah, on a surface level, we're going to label him as kind and compassionate and merciful. And despite the occasional expressions of fire and brimstone, the Torah itself describes God as, in text number 13 and page 152, he is described as God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abundant in kindness and truth. He preserves kindness for thousands of generations, etc. Well, okay, so now we have more or less cleared up God's nature. But hang on a second. We haven't quite got to the bottom of this yet, because there are still some outbursts of anger and jealousy and the like. And the question still remains, okay, so God is mostly kind and compassionate, and etc. But why would God display negative emotions at all, even if it's only on an occasional basis? I mean, you can forgive a human being for an occasional outburst of anger or an occasional display of jealousy. But God is supposed to be perfect. So why would he have these outbursts? And it just isn't good enough to say he's mostly good most of the time, but occasionally he kind of loses the plot. Yeah. So how are we going to justify this anger or this jealousy? Well, first of all, let's just understand one major difference, of course. So when we talk about anger and jealousy, it's because it's the times when we lose control of ourselves. We're hijacked by our emotions. Yes. There are occasions when you're angry with a child, but your anger is controlled and measured, and it's there for a purposeful, etc. Most times when we get angry or we get jealous is because we just haven't been able to control our better instincts, our better emotions. Okay, we're driven to do things which we often sometimes regret. We shouldn't have. I shouldn't really have been jealous. It was silly. So, anger and jealousy control us, and they cause us to be impulsive. But that's not the case with God, because God is in control. It's text number 14 on page 97, in which we say, for I am your God, I am a jealous God, I control jealousy. Jealousy does not control me. Because God doesn't experience things the way we do. He may have feelings and behave in ways that appear to be angry or jealous, but they're never impulsive acts. And exactly the same is true when we describe God as being vengeful and wrathful. His choice of reaction is going to be measured and balanced, and it's going to be based on the circumstances that are appropriate right then. And actually, not only is it okay that God feels and acts in a way that might project anger or jealousy, it actually is an important feature of Judaism. And the reason is because God lays down a moral and a religious code, and he has an expectation that human beings will keep it. And we are enjoined then to follow these ways, because this is what God wants of us. There is in this world an objective right and an objective wrong. If God didn't care when we disobeyed him, it would imply that there's nothing wrong with what we're doing. There's nothing wrong with going against what he wants of us. There's nothing wrong in transgressing his will. In other words, there's no value, therefore, in obeying it. In other words, God's positive and negative reactions are the strongest proof that what we do matters. Let me put it to you in very simple terms. Supposing one spouse betrays his or her matrimonial vows to the other and goes off and has a few affairs or whatever. And supposing that the offended spouse isn't in the least bit jealous or angry, what will that tell you about the relationship? Not good. If a child quits school and falls into, say, a life of drugs or crime, and the parents say, oh, that's okay, not bothered by that. Is this the sign of a healthy relationship? Well, because the parents love a child and because they value that child's growth, they're going to react negatively to violation. Jealousy and anger, in the proper contexts, are actually symptoms of love. Because, as we all know, true love sometimes has to include some severity. Text number 15 on page 98. Once again from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Without the quality of love,
Within
within the quality of love, there's both kindness and severity. The severity within love is not essential severity, rather it is the love expressing itself through an act of discipline. For example, when you love someone, you despise their enemies. This hatred is direct expression of your love. You love this person so much that you hate their enemies. And this is also true in a parent's love for a child. The one who loves him disciplines him early, says the book of Proverbs. And this discipline is an expression of love. And therefore, the more a parent loves their child, the more they will hold the child to a high standard, because this is not an expression of severity. It is an expression of love expressed through severity. If you see a child picking up a knife and you say, put that down, why are you saying that? Because you love the child and you don't want them to harm themselves. So you see, if God didn't care about us, he wouldn't care a hoot about what we do. When we talk about God being upset, jealous, or angry, whatever you want to call that trait, it's because he cares about what we do. Because there is a meaningful relationship. If it wouldn't bother God in the slightest when we violated the relationship, this would simply demonstrate a lack of care, concern, love. If God wouldn't react when an injustice is perpetrated in this world, it would mean that he is indifferent. And that is not our concept of a personal God who is involved with his world. So whenever the Torah describes God getting angry or jealous, it's actually a sign that a boundary has been crossed, that something sacred has been violated. And the strong response is not a sign of God being an angry God, but actually a sure sign of his love and care for the world and for his people. It is the mark of a loving God and a sign that we matter to him, that our actions actually make a difference. So our answer to the fourth question tonight. Why is God described as wrathful and jealous? And the answer is that God is overwhelmingly kind He is in control of his harsher emotions, such as jealousy and anger. And even when he exercises them, it's in order to express his love and to demonstrate how much he cares about us and our actions. And with that, we have answered our 4 questions tonight. And next week, we have another 4 questions. Do I have to believe in God to be Jewish? Nice question. Yes. Or the other way around. What if I have doubts about God's existence? Do I need to fear God? And if I'm okay with believing in God, but I'm not religious, can I still have a relationship with him? And for that, good people, we'll have to come back again next week.
Thank you.